Hello everyone, I'm Jacob, your storyteller for tonight. We're going to experience one of the most beautiful stories in all of Scripture. We're travelling to ancient Israel during the time of the Judges. It was a time of uncertainty, moral confusion, and political chaos. But in the midst of all that darkness, we find a story that shines with hope, kindness, and the quiet power of everyday faithfulness. This is Ruth's story, but not just Ruth's. It's also about Naomi, a woman whose name means pleasant, but whose life became so bitter that she asked people to call her Mara instead. It's about Boaz, a man whose generosity and integrity made him a true gentleman in an age of rough men. And it's about how God weaves together seemingly random events to accomplish his perfect purposes. Ruth wasn't even an Israelite. She was a Moabite, a foreigner, someone who worshipped different gods and came from a people often at odds with Israel. By all logic, her story should have ended in obscurity in the hills of Moab. Instead, her faithfulness made her the great-grandmother of King David and an ancestor of Jesus himself. Tonight we'll walk with Ruth through loss and loyalty, through harvest fields and midnight encounters, through uncertainty and ultimate blessing. We'll see how one woman's simple decision to stay faithful to her mother-in-law changed the course of history. So get comfortable, take a deep breath. And if you enjoy these peaceful journeys through ancient stories, take a moment to like this video and subscribe for more. Let's begin where Ruth's story truly starts, not with her birth, but with a famine that would force an entire family to leave everything they knew behind. The rains that should have come in their season simply didn't. In Bethlehem, the town whose name meant house of bread, the fields that normally waved green with barley and wheat stood brown and cracked under the relentless sun. What had started as a delayed rainy season stretched into months, then into years of drought. Elimelech stood at the edge of his withered fields, watching the dust swirl where grain should have been growing. He was a respected man in Bethlehem, someone with property, family connections, and a good reputation. But even respect couldn't make rain fall or crops grow when the heavens remained sealed like bronze. His wife Naomi tried to remain hopeful. Her name meant pleasant, and she had always been known for her warm spirit and positive outlook. But as the months passed without harvest, even Naomi's cheerfulness began to fade. The stored grain from previous years was running low, and their two young sons, Marlon and Killian, looked at their parents with questions their father couldn't answer. This was the time of the Judges, a period when Israel had no king and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. It was an era of moral confusion, spiritual compromise, and political chaos. Some said the famine was God's judgment on Israel's unfaithfulness. Others believed it was simply bad luck, the kind of natural disaster that strikes without warning or reason. But regardless of the cause, the effect was devastating. Families who had lived in Bethlehem for generations were packing up and leaving, searching for places where food was still available. The roads leading out of town carried a steady stream of refugees, their carts loaded with whatever possessions they could carry. Elimelech watched his neighbours depart. The family next door had already left for Egypt, where the Nile's flooding made drought less threatening. Others headed north toward Damascus or west toward the Mediterranean coast. Each departure reminded Elimelech that staying might mean watching his family slowly starve. The boys were growing thinner. Marlon, whose name ironically meant sickly, was living up to his name as malnutrition took its toll. Kilian, meaning failing, was also showing signs of weakness. These weren't just names. They were prophecies that seemed to be fulfilling themselves as the famine stretched on. Naomi rationed their remaining food carefully, measuring out smaller and smaller portions, trying to make their supplies last until what? Until rains that showed no sign of coming? Until a miracle that seemed increasingly unlikely? She was a woman of faith. But faith doesn't fill empty stomachs or strengthen weakening bodies. The decision Elimelech faced was heartbreaking. Stay in the promised land and risk his family's survival, or leave the land God had given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in search of food elsewhere. It wasn't just a practical choice. It was a spiritual one that would affect his family's relationship with God and their community. Every morning brought the same cloudless sky. The sun that had once blessed their crops now seemed like a curse, beating down mercilessly on the parched earth. The wells that had provided water for generations were running dry. Even the animals were suffering, their ribs showing through dull coats. Reports filtered in from travellers. There was food to be found across the Jordan River in Moab. The Moabites, descendants of Lot, were experiencing better conditions. Their harvests had been adequate. Their storage barns were full. For Israelites willing to cross the border, survival was possible. But Moab wasn't just any foreign country. It was a place with a complicated history with Israel. The Moabites worshipped different gods, followed different customs, lived by different values. Moses himself had died within sight of the promised land, forbidden to enter because of events connected to Moab. Elimelech wrestled with the decision for weeks, walking the boundaries of his family's land, praying for wisdom, hoping for rain that never came. He was a man caught between faith and survival, between trusting God's provision and taking practical action to save his family. Naomi supported whatever choice he would make. She could see the weight of responsibility crushing her husband's shoulders. He was the provider, the protector, the one who had to decide whether staying meant faithfulness or foolishness. She watched him age years in weeks as he struggled with an impossible choice. The final decision came when their youngest neighbour died. A little girl who had been playmate to Mahlon and Kilian succumbed to the effects of prolonged hunger. At her funeral, Elimelech looked at his own sons and knew he couldn't wait any longer. Principle was important, but not more important than their lives. That night, Elimelech told his family they were leaving. "We'll go to Moab," he said quietly, "just until the famine ends, just until we can return." Naomi nodded, understanding the pain in his voice. The boys were too young to fully grasp what leaving meant, but they sensed the gravity of the moment. The preparations were swift and sad, selling what they couldn't carry, storing what they hoped to reclaim, saying goodbye to neighbours who might not survive to see their return. The house that had sheltered Elimelech's family for years would stand empty, waiting for better times. As they loaded their cart with essential belongings, Elimelech looked back at Bethlehem one last time. The town that was supposed to be the house of bread had become a place of hunger. The land God had promised to provide for his people seemed to have forgotten its purpose. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. God's chosen people were leaving the promised land to find sustenance among pagans, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were becoming refugees in the land of Lot's descendants. It felt like a cosmic reversal of everything they believed about God's faithfulness. But Elimelech had made his choice. His family's immediate survival took precedence over abstract theological concerns. They would go to Moab, eat Moabite bread, drink Moabite water, and trust that God would understand. They would live as strangers in a strange land until the rains returned to Bethlehem. The road to Moab stretched ahead of them, dusty, uncertain, leading away from everything familiar toward an unknown future. But it also led toward food, toward life, toward the possibility that his family might survive this terrible time. As their cartwheels began to turn, Elimelech whispered a prayer that this journey would be temporary, that the God of Israel would watch over them in foreign territory, and that someday they would return to the house of bread, when it was truly a house of bread again. None of them could imagine that this journey to Moab would introduce a young woman named Ruth into their family story, and that her faithfulness would ultimately bring more blessing than they had ever lost by leaving. Sometimes God's greatest gifts come wrapped in our most difficult decisions. The journey from Bethlehem to Moab took several days, crossing the Jordan River and climbing into the highlands east of the Dead Sea. As Elimelech's family crested the final hill and saw the Moabite countryside spread before them, they encountered a landscape that was both foreign and welcoming. The fields here were green. Water flowed in streams that hadn't run dry. Sheep and goats grazed on hillsides where grass actually grew, for a family that had watched their homeland wither under drought. Moab looked like paradise, but it was a paradise where they would always be outsiders. Finding a place to settle wasn't easy. The Moabites were suspicious of Hebrew refugees, wondering if these newcomers might be spies or troublemakers. But Elimelech was a man of obvious education and refinement, and when he explained their situation, some families took pity on them. They found lodging in a small village, not far from the larger city centres, but close enough to markets and opportunities for work. The house they rented was simple, but it had a roof that didn't leak and walls that kept out the wind. After months of uncertainty in Bethlehem, even basic shelter felt like luxury. Elimelech worked hard to establish himself. His skills in agriculture and his knowledge of Hebrew trading practices made him valuable to Moabite farmers and merchants. Slowly, gradually, the family began to build a new life in this foreign land. Naomi struggled more with the transition. The language was similar enough to Hebrew that she could communicate, but the customs were different, the religious practices unfamiliar, the social expectations confusing. She missed her neighbours in Bethlehem, the familiar rhythms of Israelite life, the comfort of shared faith and culture. Mahlon and Kilian adapted more quickly. Young people always do. They learned Moabite customs, made friends among the local youth, and gradually began to think of Moab as home rather than exile. But this adaptation came with costs that their parents couldn't have foreseen. As the years passed, the boys reached marriageable age. The pool of potential Hebrew wives was extremely limited. Most Israelite families in Moab were in similar situations, refugees with their own struggles and uncertainties. The practical choice was to consider Moabite wives, This created a crisis of faith for Elimelech and Naomi. The law of Moses discouraged intermarriage with foreign peoples, particularly the Moabites, who had opposed Israel during the wilderness wandering, but their sons were lonely. They needed companionship, and the available Hebrew women were few. Mahlon was the first to fall in love. Her name was Ruth, and she was everything a young man could want in a wife: beautiful, kind, hard-working, intelligent. She came from a respectable Moabite family and had been raised with good values, but she worshipped Chemosh, the god of Moab, not the God of Israel. Chilion soon followed his brother's example, falling for a young woman named Orpah. Like Ruth, she was lovely and virtuous, a woman any mother would be happy to welcome as a daughter-in-law under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances. The marriages represented both hope and compromise. Hope because the young couples were genuinely happy, finding love and companionship in a foreign land. Compromise because each wedding was an acknowledgement that the family's stay in Moab might be permanent, not temporary as originally planned. Naomi welcomed her daughters-in-law with mixed emotions. She loved them as individuals, appreciated their kindness to her sons, and enjoyed their company around the house. But every day spent with Ruth and Orpah reminded her that her family was slowly becoming Moabite rather than Hebrew. The young wives brought energy and joy to the household. Ruth was particularly gifted at making everyone feel at ease. Her laughter filled rooms that had been heavy with homesickness and uncertainty. Orpah was more quiet but equally devoted, bringing a gentle stability to daily life. Both women showed respect for Elimelech and Naomi, even though Hebrew customs regarding in-laws were different from Moabite traditions. They adapted to new ways of cooking, different approaches to household management, and the subtle but important distinctions in how Hebrew families operated. The question of religion was carefully avoided. Ruth and Orpah continued to honour their ancestral gods, while Elimelech's family maintained their devotion to the God of Israel. It was an uncomfortable arrangement, but one that allowed peace to reign in the household. Elimelech found himself torn between gratitude and guilt, grateful that his sons had found happiness and his family had survived the famine. Guilty that survival had required such significant compromises. He had saved their lives, but at what cost to their spiritual heritage? Naomi watched her sons embrace Moabite culture with growing concern. They spoke Moabite as fluently as Hebrew, participated in local festivals, and seemed increasingly disconnected from their Israelite roots. The temporary exile was becoming permanent assimilation, but there were also unexpected blessings. Ruth showed genuine interest in Hebrew stories and traditions, asking thoughtful questions about the God of Israel, listening carefully when Naomi shared memories of life in Bethlehem. Perhaps the cultural exchange wasn't entirely one-directional. The years in Moab brought prosperity to the family. Elimelech's business ventures were successful. The young couples seemed happy and settled. There was talk of grandchildren, of a future that might be built in this foreign land rather than the homeland they had left behind. Yet homesickness never completely disappeared, especially for Naomi, who dreamed of Bethlehem's familiar streets and wondered about neighbours they had left behind. Letters from relatives were rare, and news from Judah came mainly through travelling merchants who might be months out of date. The compromise of living in Moab became a new normal. The family had Hebrew hearts but Moabite addresses. Israelite memories but Moabite futures. They were survivors who had successfully adapted to circumstances beyond their control. But they were also exiles who had paid a price for their survival. As the 10th year of their residence in Moab approached, the family had achieved a kind of stability, not the life they had planned, but a life that worked, not the future they had imagined, but a future that seemed secure and promising. Ruth and Orpah had become true daughters to Naomi, filling gaps in her heart that she hadn't even realized were empty. Their devotion to their husbands, their kindness to their in-laws, and their integration into the family dynamic had created something beautiful, even if it wasn't traditionally Hebrew. The God of Israel seemed distant in this foreign land, his presence less obvious than it had been in the Promised Land. But perhaps, Naomi sometimes wondered, God's care for his people extended beyond geographical boundaries. Perhaps even in Moab, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was watching over them. None of them could have predicted that their carefully constructed new life was about to be shattered, that the stability they had built would crumble, and that the true test of their relationships was just beginning. Sometimes God allows us to build comfortable compromises, only to call us back to deeper faithfulness through unexpected trials. The first death came without warning. Elimelech had been working in the fields when he simply collapsed, his heart giving out after years of stress, displacement, and the weight of difficult decisions. The man who had saved his family by bringing them to Moab would never see them return to Bethlehem. Naomi's grief was overwhelming. In a single moment, she had lost her husband, her protector, her partner in all the compromises and adaptations of their exile. The man who had wrestled with God over their departure from the Promised Land was gone, leaving her to face an uncertain future without his strength and wisdom. The funeral was conducted according to Moabite customs, since that was where they were, but Naomi insisted on Hebrew prayers and traditions as well. It was a strange hybrid ceremony that reflected their family's complicated existence, caught between two cultures, two sets of expectations, two different ways of understanding life and death. Mahlon and Kilian stepped up to care for their mother, taking over their father's business interests, managing the household finances, and trying to fill the enormous gap left by Elimelech's death. But they were young men, not yet fully prepared for such responsibilities, especially in a foreign land where their status was always somewhat precarious. Ruth and Orpah grieved for their father-in-law. He had welcomed them into his family despite the cultural barriers, treated them with kindness despite the religious differences, and made them feel valued despite being foreigners to his heritage. His death left them feeling more vulnerable and uncertain about their place in the family. For 2 years, the family struggled to find a new equilibrium. Naomi was the matriarch now, but without Elimelech's earnings and business connections, their financial situation became increasingly difficult. The prosperity they had achieved was slipping away, and their security was more fragile than they had realized. Then disease struck their small community. The same illness that had taken several neighbors reached their household, and Mahlon fell sick first. Ruth nursed him devotedly, using every remedy she knew, seeking help from Moabite healers and Hebrew traditions alike. But despite all her efforts, her husband grew weaker each day. Mahlon's death was agonizing for Ruth. She had loved him genuinely, found in him not just a husband but a friend and companion who had helped her navigate the complexities of cross-cultural marriage. His loss left her not just widowed, but questioning everything she had believed about the future. Killian followed his brother within weeks. The same disease that had claimed Marlon proved equally fatal to the younger son. Orpah's grief mirrored Ruth's. Sudden widowhood in a household that was rapidly becoming a collection of women with no male protection or support. Naomi's response to losing both sons was devastating. The woman whose name meant pleasant became bitter, angry, and convinced that God had turned against her. "The Lord's hand has turned against me," she cried, feeling abandoned by the very God her family had tried to serve even in exile. The practical implications of their situation were terrifying. In the ancient world, women without male relatives had few rights and little protection. They couldn't inherit property easily, conduct business independently, or travel safely. Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah were suddenly among society's most vulnerable members. Their financial resources dwindled quickly. Without Elimelech's business income or the young men's labour, they struggled to pay rent, buy food, and maintain even basic living standards. The comfortable life they had built in Moab was disappearing as rapidly as their family members. Neighbours who had been friendly when the family was prosperous became distant and cool. Some Moabites saw their misfortune as evidence that foreign gods were punishing the Hebrew family for their presence in the land. Others simply couldn't afford to help, having their own struggles and survival to worry about. The three women were forced to rely on each other in ways they had never imagined, sharing grief, pooling resources, and trying to figure out how to survive in a world that offered few options for women alone. Their relationships, tested by tragedy, grew deeper but also more complicated. Naomi's faith was shattered. She had followed her husband to this foreign land, watched her sons marry foreign women, and now buried her entire male family line. Where was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Where was the divine protection that was supposed to follow his chosen people? Ruth and Orpah faced their own spiritual crises. They had been drawn to their husband's Hebrew faith, intrigued by the stories of a God who cared personally for his people. But this God seemed to have abandoned the very family that had been most faithful to him. What did that say about his character or reliability? The isolation was perhaps the worst part. They were foreigners mourning Hebrew men in a Moabite land, outsiders to both communities, belonging fully to neither. Their grief was compounded by loneliness, their loss magnified by their displacement from any supportive community. Practical decisions became overwhelming. How long could they afford to stay in their current home? Where would they go if they had to leave? How would they earn money to survive? Every choice seemed impossible. Every option fraught with danger or despair. Naomi began to withdraw into herself, spending long hours in silence, refusing comfort, and speaking mainly to express her bitterness toward God and life. The woman who had once been the family's emotional center became its most wounded and difficult member. Ruth and Orpah tried to maintain some semblance of normal life, cooking meals that barely anyone ate, maintaining a household that felt empty and purposeless, going through motions that seemed increasingly meaningless. They were young women whose lives had been completely derailed by circumstances beyond their control. The question of remarriage arose, but the options were limited and complicated. As widows of Hebrew men, their status in Moabite society was unclear. Would Moabite men want to marry women associated with foreign tragedy? Would Hebrew families accept Moabite daughters-in-law who had already been widowed? Hope seemed as dead as the men they had buried. The future that had looked so promising just months earlier was now a terrifying void of uncertainty and potential poverty. 3 women, bonded by grief, faced a world that offered them few opportunities and little security. But in the midst of their despair, seeds of character were being planted. Ruth's loyalty to Naomi deepened through shared suffering. Orpah's practical wisdom helped them manage day-to-day survival, and Naomi, despite her bitterness, was learning that some relationships transcend cultural boundaries and religious differences. The bitter years were testing everything they thought they knew about love, faith, and family. The comfortable compromises of their Moabite exile had been stripped away, leaving only the raw essence of human connection and divine sovereignty. None of them knew that this seeming end was actually a beginning, that God was preparing to write a love story that would span generations, and that their greatest blessings would emerge from their deepest losses. Sometimes God allows everything to fall apart, so that something better can be built from the pieces. The news came through a travelling merchant who had business connections in both Moab and Judah. "The famine is over in Bethlehem," he told them almost casually, unaware that his words would change everything for 3 grieving widows. "The rains have returned. The harvests are good again. People are saying the Lord has blessed his people." Naomi listened to this report with mixed emotions. Relief that her homeland was no longer suffering, but also a deep ache of longing for the place where she truly belonged. Bethlehem, the house of bread, was living up to its name again, while she remained in exile among people who worshipped foreign gods. For days after hearing the news, Naomi couldn't stop thinking about home. She imagined the familiar hills around Bethlehem, green again with grain, the markets full of fresh bread and new wine. She pictured neighbours she had known since childhood, wondered who had survived the famine, who had prospered since the rains returned. Ruth and Orpah watched Naomi's growing restlessness with concern. They could see the longing in her eyes, the way she stared toward the west where the sun set over the land she had left behind. The news from Bethlehem had awakened something in their mother-in-law that neither daughter-in-law could satisfy. The idea of returning began as a whisper in Naomi's heart, then grew into a persistent thought, finally becoming an overwhelming conviction. She was a Hebrew woman, a daughter of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Her place was in the promised land, not in this foreign territory where her family had died and her faith had been tested beyond endurance. But the practical obstacles were enormous. Naomi was a widow with no male relatives to protect her, no property waiting for her in Bethlehem, no guaranteed welcome after 10 years of absence. She would be returning as a penniless refugee to a community that might have forgotten her, or worse, might blame her family for abandoning their land during the crisis. The financial realities were daunting. The journey from Moab to Bethlehem would require resources they barely had, food for the road, protection from bandits, places to stay along the way. Even if they managed to reach Bethlehem, they would arrive with nothing, dependent on the charity of relatives who might themselves be struggling to rebuild after the famine. But Naomi's desperation outweighed her practical concerns. Life in Moab had become unbearable. Every familiar place reminded her of losses. Every Moabite religious festival highlighted her spiritual isolation. Every day emphasized her status as a permanent exile. If she was going to be poor and lonely, at least she could be poor and lonely in her homeland. The decision crystallized when their landlord informed them that the rent would increase. Their reduced circumstances made the higher payment impossible, and the alternatives in Moab were even worse. This external pressure became the catalyst that turned Naomi's longing into action. "I'm going back to Bethlehem," Naomi announced one evening, her voice carrying a determination that surprised even herself. Ruth and Orpah looked at each other, understanding immediately that this wasn't a casual comment but a firm decision that would change all their lives. The conversation that followed was painful and honest. Naomi explained that she had nothing left to offer her daughters-in-law, no sons for them to marry, no inheritance to share, no prospects for improving their situation. In her homeland, they would be foreigners, outsiders, women whose Moabite heritage would make them objects of suspicion or discrimination. "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home," Naomi urged them, her voice breaking with emotion. "May the Lord show you kindness, as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." It was both a blessing and a dismissal. Naomi was trying to free Ruth and Orpah from any obligation to follow her into an uncertain future. She loved them enough to encourage them to find happiness and security, even if it meant losing the only family connections she had left. Ruth and Orpah wept at this suggestion. The bonds formed through marriage, deepened through shared grief, weren't easily broken. These women had become true daughters to Naomi, and she had become a beloved mother to them. The thought of separation was agonizing for all three. "We will go back with you to your people," they protested. But Naomi insisted on painting the bleakest possible picture of what awaited them. She was too old to remarry and bear sons, even if she were to find a husband that very night. Would Ruth and Orpah wait for infants to grow up? Would they remain unmarried for decades while hypothetical children reached marriageable age? The logic was undeniable. Following Naomi to Bethlehem meant accepting permanent widowhood, cultural displacement, economic uncertainty, and social marginalization. It was a choice that made sense only if love outweighed every practical consideration. Naomi's bitterness poured out as she spoke. "It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." She felt cursed, abandoned by the God she had served, punished for reasons she couldn't understand. Why would she invite these young women to share in her divine rejection? The preparation for departure was emotional and practical, sorting through possessions to determine what could be carried, what should be sold, what might be left behind. Every item they abandoned represented another connection to their life in Moab, another memory of the men they had loved and lost. Neighbours came to say goodbye. Some wished them well. Others warned them about the dangers of travel. A few questioned the wisdom of leaving Moab for an uncertain future in a foreign land. The mixed reactions reflected the complexity of their situation. Refugees leaving their refuge. The house that had been their sanctuary became empty again. Rooms that had echoed with laughter, arguments, tears, and the ordinary sounds of family life fell silent. The walls that had witnessed births, deaths, marriages, and daily routines would soon shelter different families with different stories. As the day of departure approached, Ruth and Orpah faced their own agonizing decisions. Stay in Moab with the possibility of remarriage and cultural belonging, or follow Naomi into exile with love as their only inheritance. It was a choice between security and loyalty, practical wisdom and emotional commitment. Naomi continued to discourage them, not from lack of love, but from abundance of it. She wanted them to have children, homes, husbands, futures uncomplicated by the prejudices they would face as Moabite women in Israel. Her insistence on their departure was her final gift of maternal care. The night before they planned to leave, the three women sat together in their empty house, sharing memories, fears, and hopes. Tomorrow would bring farewells that might last forever, choices that couldn't be unmade, and a journey into the unknown that would test every relationship they valued. None of them slept well. Tomorrow would reveal who loved deeply enough to embrace uncertainty, who was practical enough to choose security, and whether the bonds formed in a foreign land could survive the journey to another foreign land. The decision to return was made, but the harder decisions about who would actually make that return were still to come. The morning of departure arrived grey and overcast, as if the sky itself reflected the sombre mood of three women preparing to make choices that would define the rest of their lives. They had packed their few remaining possessions, said their final goodbyes to neighbours, and stood at the crossroads that would determine their futures. Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah began walking together toward the road that led to Bethlehem, their footsteps creating a rhythm of shared purpose and mutual support. But everyone understood that this togetherness was temporary, that somewhere along this journey, painful separations would occur. They had travelled only a short distance when Naomi stopped and turned to face her daughters-in-law. Her heart was breaking, but her resolve was firm. She could not, would not, allow these young women to sacrifice their lives for an old woman's desperate need for companionship. "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home," she said again, her voice trembling with emotion but her words clear and decisive. "May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband." Then Naomi kissed them goodbye, a gesture of blessing and dismissal, love and separation. The tears that had been threatening all morning finally came, flowing down three faces as they faced the reality of losing each other just when they needed family most. Orpah and Ruth wept, clinging to Naomi, protesting again that they wanted to return with her to her people. The bond between them had grown strong through shared joy and shared grief. They were more than in-laws. They were true daughters and a true mother, family by choice rather than just circumstance. But Naomi was relentless in her logic and her love. "Turn back, my daughters," she insisted. "Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may be your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband." Her words painted the starkest possible picture. Even if she married that very night, even if she bore sons in her old age, would Ruth and Orpah wait 15 or 20 years for those boys to grow up? Would they waste their youth and beauty waiting for an impossible future? No. My daughters, Naomi continued, her voice growing more passionate and more desperate, it grieves me much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. She truly believed that following her meant sharing in divine punishment, becoming victims of whatever curse had destroyed her family. The moment of choice had arrived. Orpah looked at Ruth. Ruth looked at Orpah, and both looked at Naomi with hearts torn between love and logic, loyalty and self-preservation, the security of the known and the uncertainty of the unknown. Orpah was the first to break. She lifted up her voice and wept, embracing Naomi with genuine love and genuine grief, but then, with tears streaming down her face, she kissed her mother-in-law goodbye and turned back toward her homeland, her culture, her gods, and her future. It was the practical choice, the reasonable decision, the course of action that any sensible person would recommend. Orpah was young, beautiful, from a good family. She could remarry in Moab, have children, live a normal life surrounded by familiar customs and supportive relatives. Staying made perfect sense. Naomi watched Orpah walk away with mixed emotions, sadness at losing another daughter, but also relief that at least one of them had chosen wisely. "Look," she said to Ruth, "your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth had made a different calculation. Her love for Naomi ran deeper than practical considerations. Her commitment to this family transcended cultural boundaries. Her choice was based not on what made sense, but on what felt true in her heart. Ruth's response has echoed through history. Words of loyalty and love that have inspired countless people facing impossible choices. "Entreat me not to leave you, or to turn back from following after you, for wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God." The depth of Ruth's commitment was stunning. She wasn't just choosing to travel to Bethlehem. She was choosing to abandon her Moabite identity completely. She was embracing Hebrew culture, Hebrew religion, Hebrew destiny, regardless of the cost or consequences. "Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried," Ruth continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me." She was making a covenant, swearing an oath, binding herself to Naomi's fate, whatever that might bring. Ruth's declaration was radical in its scope and shocking in its finality. She was choosing love over security, loyalty over logic, faith over familiarity. She was betting her entire future on an old woman's God and an uncertain welcome in a foreign land. Naomi was stunned into silence. She had expected both daughters-in-law to make Orpah's practical choice, to return to their families and their futures in Moab. Ruth's unexpected loyalty left her speechless, overwhelmed by love she didn't think she deserved and commitment she hadn't dared to hope for. The contrast between the two young women was striking, but neither choice was wrong. Orpah chose with her head. Ruth chose with her heart. Orpah chose the probable. Ruth chose the possible. Orpah chose what made sense. Ruth chose what felt right. Ruth's decision revealed her character in ways that years of ordinary life had not. When forced to choose between comfort and commitment, she chose commitment. When faced with uncertainty versus security, she chose uncertainty. When offered the chance to start over, she chose instead to see her current story through to its conclusion. Naomi realized that further argument was useless. Ruth's mind was made up. Her heart was committed. Her future was cast. When Naomi saw that she was steadfastly minded to go with her, she left speaking unto her. Sometimes love has to accept what it cannot change. The two women, now travelling alone, resumed their journey toward Bethlehem. Each step took Ruth further from everything she had ever known and closer to a future she couldn't imagine. But she walked without regret, without looking back, without second-guessing her choice. Behind them, Orpah continued her own journey back to familiar territory. Perhaps she remarried, had children, lived happily among her own people. Her story ended there, practical and wise, but forgotten by history. Ahead of Ruth and Naomi lay uncertainty, poverty, potential rejection, and cultural displacement. But also, unknown to them, lay love, purpose, legacy, and a place in the genealogy of kings. Sometimes the most foolish choices turn out to be the wisest, and sometimes love really is enough. Ruth had chosen her people, her God, and her destiny. The young Moabite woman was about to become a Hebrew, not by birth, but by choice, not by circumstance, but by covenant. Her decision to say, "Where you go, I will go," had just changed the course of biblical history. The road to Bethlehem stretched ahead of them, dusty and uncertain, but walked now by two women whose love for each other had proven stronger than every practical consideration. Ruth's faithfulness was about to be rewarded in ways she could never have imagined. The journey from Moab to Bethlehem would take several days, covering rough terrain that challenged even experienced travellers. For two widowed women with limited resources and no male protection, every mile presented potential dangers and definite difficulties. Naomi and Ruth walked mostly in silence during those first hours, each lost in her own thoughts about what lay behind and what waited ahead. The emotional weight of their choices was almost as heavy as the small bundles of possessions they carried on their backs. Ruth found herself looking over her shoulder frequently, watching the familiar hills of Moab fade into the distance, perhaps wondering if she would ever see them again. Everything she had ever known was disappearing behind her, while everything unknown stretched endlessly ahead. The road they travelled was ancient, worn by countless feet over centuries of trade and migration. Caravans had passed this way carrying spices from Arabia. Merchants had walked these paths with goods from distant lands, and refugees like themselves had fled in both directions depending on where safety and sustenance could be found. As they descended toward the Jordan River, Ruth caught her first glimpses of the landscape that would become her new home. The hills were different from Moab's, the vegetation subtly changed. Even the quality of light seemed transformed. She was entering not just a new country, but a new world. The Jordan crossing was both symbolic and practical. The river that separated Moab from Israel also separated Ruth's past from her future, her old identity from her new covenant, her birth heritage from her chosen destiny. With each step into the shallow water, she was becoming less Moabite and more Hebrew. Naomi watched Ruth carefully during these transitional moments, looking for signs of regret, fear, or second thoughts. But Ruth's face showed only determination mixed with natural curiosity about her new surroundings. The young woman who had pledged loyalty was proving faithful to her word. The climb up from the Jordan Valley was steep and exhausting. The sun beat down mercilessly on travellers who had no shelter, no rest stops, no relief from the physical demands of their journey. Ruth's feet, unaccustomed to such distances, began to blister and ache within the first few hours. They met other travellers along the way, some friendly, others suspicious of two women travelling alone. A few merchants offered them brief companionship and shared information about road conditions ahead, but mostly they walked alone, two small figures against the vast landscape. Water was a constant concern. They had to ration their supply carefully, knowing that sources were unreliable and not always safe to drink. Ruth learned to judge by Naomi's behaviour when it was wise to drink and when it was better to endure thirst until a better source appeared. Food was equally challenging. They carried what little they could afford, mostly dried bread and a few preserved fruits. Ruth discovered that hunger was a persistent companion on long journeys, gnawing at strength and concentration, making every step more difficult than the last. The nights were perhaps the most challenging part of their journey, with no money for inns and no relatives to host them. They slept under the stars when weather permitted, or sought shelter in caves or abandoned structures when storms threatened. Ruth had never experienced such exposure and vulnerability. Naomi shared stories as they walked, telling Ruth about Bethlehem, about Hebrew customs, about the God of Israel whom Ruth had chosen to serve. These conversations served multiple purposes: education, distraction from discomfort, and bonding between the two women who now depended entirely on each other. Ruth listened with fascination to accounts of Hebrew festivals, religious practices, and social expectations. She was receiving a crash course in how to be Hebrew, learning not just about different customs, but about a completely different world view, one centered on relationship with an invisible but very real God. The stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob captivated Ruth's imagination. Here were accounts of people who had also left their homelands in response to divine calling, who had also trusted promises they couldn't fully understand, who had also found blessing through faith rather than circumstances. As they approached the borders of Judah, Naomi's mood began to change. The prospect of homecoming stirred complex emotions, excitement mixed with anxiety, hope tempered by realistic concerns about their reception. 10 years was a long time to be away, especially 10 years that had included so much loss. Ruth sensed the change in her mother-in-law and tried to offer comfort, but there was little she could say. Having never experienced homecoming, she couldn't fully understand Naomi's emotional turmoil. Instead, she simply maintained steady companionship, sharing the burden of uncertainty. The landscape gradually became more familiar to Naomi. Landmarks she remembered from childhood journeys, hills that held memories of happier times, valleys where her family had once travelled together for festivals and celebrations. Every familiar sight reminded her of how much she had lost. Ruth experienced her first taste of what life would be like as a Moabite woman in Israel. The looks, the whispers, the subtle but unmistakable message that she was an outsider. These moments tested her resolve, but also strengthened her determination to prove herself worthy of acceptance. Naomi apologized for the less than warm reception, explaining that people were naturally cautious about foreigners, especially during times of economic difficulty. But she also warned Ruth that acceptance would have to be earned, that her Moabite heritage would always make some people suspicious or hostile. As they crested the final hill before Bethlehem, both women fell silent. Naomi, seeing her hometown spread before her after 10 years of exile. Ruth, seeing for the first time the place that would define the rest of her life. The moment was heavy with significance for both of them. The sun was setting behind them, casting long shadows across the fields and streets of Bethlehem. The town looked peaceful, prosperous, recovered from the famine that had driven Naomi's family away. Smoke rose from cooking fires, children played in the streets. Life had returned to normal. But normal for Bethlehem meant foreign for Ruth. Every building, every custom, every expectation would be new and challenging. She was about to test whether love really was strong enough to bridge every cultural gap, whether loyalty could overcome every obstacle. The long road to Bethlehem was ending, but Ruth's real journey was just beginning. Tomorrow she would wake up in the promised land, no longer a visitor but a resident, no longer protected by the temporary status of a traveller, but exposed to all the complexities of permanent life among strangers who might never fully accept her. As they walked down the hill toward their new life, both women were thinking about the irony of their situation. Naomi was coming home but felt like a stranger. Ruth was entering foreign territory but had found her true family. Sometimes the most important journeys are not about geography, but about the heart. The gates of Bethlehem came into view just as the sun reached its highest point, casting sharp shadows across the familiar stone walls and wooden doorways that had once defined the boundaries of Naomi's world. The town looked smaller than she remembered, but also more prosperous. Clear evidence that the terrible famine had indeed ended. Ruth stayed close to Naomi as they approached the entrance, sensing her mother-in-law's growing tension and her own increasing nervousness about this first encounter with Hebrew society. Everything about the town was foreign to her, from the architecture to the clothing styles to the sounds of conversation drifting from the marketplace. Their arrival didn't go unnoticed. Travel-worn strangers always attracted attention in small communities. But there was something about these two women that caused people to stop and stare, to whisper among themselves, to gather in small groups, pointing and speculating about their identity. Then recognition began to dawn. "Is this Naomi?" someone asked, the question rippling through the crowd like a stone dropped in still water. Faces that had been merely curious became shocked, amazed, concerned. The woman they remembered as pleasant and prosperous looked aged, worn, marked by hardship and loss. Word spread quickly through the town. "Naomi has returned." The news travelled faster than the two women could walk, so that by the time they reached the centre of Bethlehem, a substantial crowd had gathered to witness this unexpected homecoming. Ruth found herself the object of intense scrutiny. People stared at her clothing, her features, her way of walking. searching for clues about her identity and origins. She could hear the whispered questions. Who is she? Where did she come from? Is she one of us? Naomi was overwhelmed by the attention. After years of anonymity in Moab, she was suddenly the center of community interest. Everyone wanted to know where she had been, what had happened to her family, why she looked so different from the woman who had left Bethlehem 10 years earlier. "Don't call me Naomi," she said to the gathering crowd, her voice carrying years of accumulated bitterness and pain. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty." The name change was significant. Naomi meant pleasant, while Mara meant bitter. In choosing this new identity, she was publicly acknowledging how profoundly her life had been altered, how completely her circumstances had changed, how thoroughly her faith had been tested. Ruth listened to this declaration with growing understanding. This was her first real glimpse into the depth of Naomi's spiritual struggle, the extent of her anger toward God, the magnitude of her sense of abandonment and betrayal. The woman who had been her anchor was revealing herself to be as lost as Ruth felt. "Why call me Naomi?" Naomi continued, her voice growing stronger and more passionate. "The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." She was publicly airing her grievances against God, expressing doubts and complaints that many people feel, but few dare voice so openly. The crowd responded with a mixture of sympathy and discomfort. They understood loss. They had all survived the famine and its aftermath, but Naomi's bitterness was more intense, more public, more challenging to conventional expressions of faith than most people were prepared to handle. Ruth remained silent throughout this exchange, observing, learning, trying to understand the cultural and religious dynamics at play. She was witnessing her first Hebrew community gathering, seeing how these people related to each other, to their past, and to their God. Some neighbours approached with genuine warmth, offering condolences for her losses, expressing joy at her return, asking practical questions about her needs and circumstances. These people represented the best of Hebrew community life, the tradition of caring for widows and strangers. Others kept their distance, whether from uncertainty about how to respond to such public bitterness or from suspicion about the foreign woman accompanying Naomi. Ruth could feel their eyes upon her, assessing, judging, trying to determine whether she represented help or threat to their community. An older woman who had been Naomi's close friend approached Ruth directly. "And who is this?" she asked kindly but with obvious curiosity. It was Ruth's first opportunity to identify herself to her new community, to begin the process of explaining her presence and her commitment. "This is Ruth, my daughter-in-law from Moab," Naomi answered before Ruth could speak. "She has come with me." The introduction was brief, factual, but also protective. Naomi was claiming Ruth as family, establishing her legitimacy, giving her a place in the community structure. Ruth bowed respectfully, using the greeting she had learned from watching Naomi, trying to show proper deference while also maintaining dignity. This first impression would be crucial in determining how the community would receive her, whether they would see her as friend or foreigner. The mention of Moab created a subtle shift in the crowd's reaction. Moabites had a complicated history with Israel, sometimes allies, sometimes enemies, always foreigners with different gods and different customs. Ruth could sense the increased scrutiny, the unspoken questions about her intentions and loyalties. Children gathered around the edges of the crowd, staring openly at Ruth with the unfiltered curiosity of youth. To them, she was simply something new and interesting, someone different from anyone they had seen before. Their innocent stares were somehow less threatening than the calculated looks of their parents. As the initial excitement of Naomi's return began to settle, practical concerns emerged. Where would they live? How would they support themselves? What help did they need? The community's response to these questions would determine whether Naomi's homecoming would be blessing or burden. Several people offered temporary shelter, recognizing that two widowed women arriving with minimal possessions would need immediate assistance. The Hebrew tradition of hospitality was being tested, and for the most part, it was meeting the challenge with generosity and kindness. But Ruth could also sense the underlying tensions, the whispered conversations about Naomi's bitter words, the glances directed at her own foreign appearance, the questions about how long they planned to stay, whether they would be contributions to the community or drains upon its resources. The marketplace where they stood was bustling with activity, evidence of the good harvests that had followed the famine's end. Grain was plentiful, livestock looked healthy, people appeared well-fed and prosperous. It was a stark contrast to the desperation that had driven Naomi's family away. Ruth tried to absorb everything, the sights, sounds, smells, and social dynamics of Hebrew community life. This was her crash course in becoming Israeli, her introduction to the culture she had chosen to embrace, her first glimpse of the people she had promised to make her own. As the crowd gradually dispersed, Ruth and Naomi found themselves with a small group of women who had been Naomi's closest friends. These would be the relationships that could make or break Ruth's integration into the community, the connections that would determine whether she found acceptance or rejection. The conversation turned to practical matters: where to find housing, how to obtain food, what work might be available for women in their situation. It was during this discussion that someone mentioned the barley harvest, noting that gleaning would soon be available for those who needed it. Ruth listened with particular interest to this information. Gleaning was a Hebrew custom that allowed the poor to gather grain left behind by harvesters. It was dignified work that provided sustenance without requiring charity. But it was also the work of the desperate, the last resort for those with no other options. As the sun began to set on their first day in Bethlehem, Ruth realized that she and Naomi were indeed among the desperate, two widows with no male protectors, no property, no income. They would need to swallow pride, embrace humility, and work in whatever ways were available to survive. The homecoming had been emotionally exhausting for both women. Naomi, confronted with the past she had lost and the community she had left. Ruth, overwhelmed by the cultural immersion and the reality of her new status as a foreign widow in a strange land. But as they settled into the simple lodging that kind neighbours had provided, both women understood that this was just the beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new tests of their commitment to each other and to the choices they had made. Ruth was no longer travelling toward her new life. She was living it. The young Moabite woman who had pledged to make Naomi's people her people was about to discover what that promise would cost and what it might yield. The morning after their arrival in Bethlehem, Ruth woke to the sound of activity in the streets, the rhythmic sounds of preparation, the calls of workers heading to the fields, and the general bustle of a community engaged in the crucial work of harvest. She lay still for a moment, absorbing the reality that this was now her life, her community, her responsibility. Naomi remained in bed, overwhelmed by the emotional weight of her return, the exhaustion of travel, and the depression that had settled over her like a heavy cloak. The woman who had once been known for her pleasant disposition seemed unable to face another day of struggle and uncertainty. Ruth quietly rose and assessed their situation with clear eyes. They had shelter for now through the kindness of neighbours, but that generosity wouldn't last forever. They had eaten yesterday from gifts of food, but today they would need to find their own sustenance. Someone had to take action, and it clearly wouldn't be Naomi. "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favour," Ruth said gently to her mother-in-law. She was proposing to become a gleaner, one of the poor who followed behind the harvesters, gathering whatever grain was dropped or left behind. Gleaning was legal under Hebrew law, a provision that God had established through Moses to care for the poor, the widows, the orphans, and the foreigners. Landowners were required to leave the corners of their fields unharvested, to not go back for forgotten sheaves, and to allow the needy to gather what remained. But legal didn't mean easy, or dignified, or welcome. Ruth would be working alongside other desperate people, competing for scraps, subject to the attitudes and whims of field supervisors and landowners. She would be advertising her poverty, accepting charity, swallowing pride with every handful of grain she gathered. Naomi gave her permission with a weary nod. "Go ahead, my daughter." She seemed grateful that Ruth was willing to take initiative, but also resigned to the necessity that had reduced them to such humble circumstances. The pleasant woman had become someone who expected little good from life. Ruth prepared for her first day as a gleaner with determination and nervous energy. She had no idea which fields might be welcoming to foreigners, which supervisors might be kind, or which workers might be hostile. She was entering an unfamiliar world where her success would depend on the mercy of strangers. The walk to the fields gave Ruth her first close look at Hebrew agricultural practices. The barley was golden and ready. Workers moved efficiently through the rows with sharp sickles, and overseers called out instructions and encouragement. It was organised, productive, and completely foreign to her experience. Ruth approached the gleaning with practical wisdom. She looked for fields where the initial harvest seemed generous, where dropped grain was plentiful, where the workers appeared good-natured rather than hostile. Her survival depended on making smart choices about where to invest her time and energy. The work itself was back-breaking, bending over constantly to pick up individual stalks, carrying increasingly heavy bundles, competing with other gleaners for the best spots, moving quickly before the good grain was gone. Ruth's hands, unused to such labour, quickly became raw and blistered. The other gleaners were a mixed group. Some were local poor who worked the harvests every year. Others were recent refugees or people experiencing temporary hardship. A few were professional beggars who supplemented their income through seasonal field work. Ruth was the only foreigner, the only Moabite. She faced curiosity, suspicion, and occasional hostility from both workers and fellow gleaners. Some questioned her right to be there. Others made comments about Moabites taking food from Hebrew mouths. A few simply ignored her, treating her as invisible, irrelevant, unworthy of acknowledgement. But Ruth also encountered unexpected kindness. A few gleaners showed her the best techniques for efficient gathering. Some workers deliberately dropped extra grain where she could reach it. One elderly woman shared water from her jar during the hottest part of the day. The physical demands were exhausting. Ruth had never worked so hard for so little. Every handful of grain represented significant effort. Every bundle she gathered felt precious because she understood its importance to their survival. This wasn't theoretical poverty. It was practical desperation. By midday, Ruth had gathered a respectable amount of grain, but her back ached. Her hands were bleeding, and her energy was flagging. She was learning that gleaning was a full-time job that required both physical stamina and emotional resilience. During the brief rest period when the heat became unbearable, Ruth observed the social dynamics of the harvest, the easy camaraderie among the regular workers, the respect shown to supervisors, the occasional jokes and conversations that made the hard work bearable. She was an outsider to all of it. Some of the younger workers stared at her with undisguised curiosity. A Moabite woman was unusual enough to be interesting, but her dedication to the work, her obvious need, and her quiet dignity commanded a certain respect even from those who might have been inclined to mock. Ruth was also learning about Hebrew religious customs through observation. The prayers offered before meals, the references to God's blessing on the harvest, the way work stopped at certain times for religious observances. She was getting a practical education in the faith she had chosen to embrace. As the afternoon wore on, Ruth's determination was tested by fatigue, discouragement, and the humbling reality of her situation. 6 months ago, she had been a respected wife in a comfortable household. Now she was begging for scraps in foreign fields, dependent on the charity of strangers for basic survival. But her commitment to Naomi kept her going. Every grain she gathered was food for both of them. Every bundle she collected brought them closer to making it through another day. Her love for her mother-in-law transformed drudgery into purpose, charity into dignity. The field supervisors watched the gleaners carefully, making sure they didn't take more than was appropriate, didn't interfere with the main harvest, and didn't cause problems among the workers. Ruth was conscious of being observed, evaluated, judged for her behavior and attitude. She made a point of being respectful, hard-working, and unobtrusive, asking permission when necessary, thanking people for small kindnesses, and avoiding any behavior that might reflect poorly on her or create problems for future gleaning opportunities. As the sun began to set, Ruth gathered her day's collection, a bundle of grain that represented hope, survival, and the fruit of honest labour. It wasn't much by the standards of her former life, but it was everything in her current circumstances. The walk home was exhausting but satisfying. Ruth had proven to herself that she could work, could contribute, could take care of both herself and Naomi through her own efforts. She wasn't just a burden on the community. She was someone willing to earn her place through dedication and hard work. She was also processing the emotional impact of her first day as a Hebrew gleaner, the humiliation, the exhaustion, the small kindnesses, the casual cruelties, the complex dynamics of a society she was still learning to navigate. Every interaction had been a lesson in her new reality. As she approached their temporary lodging, Ruth wondered how to present her day to Naomi, how to share the challenges without seeming to complain, how to communicate the small victories without minimizing the difficulties. She wanted to encourage her mother-in-law without being dishonest about their situation. But mostly, Ruth felt a quiet pride in what she had accomplished. She had fed them both through her own efforts. She had taken the first step toward establishing herself in Bethlehem. She had proven that a Moabite woman could work honorably in Hebrew fields. Tomorrow she would return to gleaning, and the day after that, and as long as the harvest lasted, each day would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new tests of her commitment to the choice she had made. But today had been a beginning, and that was enough. On her second day of gleaning, Ruth chose a different field, one that belonged to a man named Boaz. It seemed like a random decision, based on practical considerations like the generosity of the initial harvest and the attitude of the workers she observed. But sometimes what appears to be chance is actually divine appointment. Boaz was a man of standing in Bethlehem, wealthy, respected, and known for his integrity and kindness. His fields were extensive, his workers numerous, and his harvests consistently good. He was also, though Ruth didn't know it, a relative of Elimelech, connected to Naomi's family through ancient kinship ties. Ruth arrived early, eager to secure a good spot among the gleaners and to demonstrate her commitment to honest work. She moved through the field with the same determination she had shown the previous day, bending, gathering, carrying, building another bundle of grain for their survival. The other gleaners in Boaz's field seemed more relaxed than those she had encountered elsewhere. The atmosphere was less competitive, more generous, suggesting that the landowner was known for fair treatment of the poor. Ruth felt cautiously optimistic about her choice of location. Boaz arrived at the field mid-morning, making his regular inspection of the harvest progress, greeting his workers, and overseeing the various aspects of the operation. He was hands-on in his management, personally involved rather than distant, caring about both productivity and the welfare of those who worked for him. "The Lord be with you," he called to his workers, and they responded, "The Lord bless you." This exchange revealed something important about Boaz's character. He was a man who acknowledged God's role in their prosperity, who treated his workers with dignity, and who created an atmosphere of mutual respect rather than mere economic transaction. As Boaz surveyed the field, his eye was caught by someone he didn't recognize. A young woman working among the gleaners with obvious dedication but unfamiliar features. In a small community like Bethlehem, strangers were noticeable, especially beautiful young women who carried themselves with dignity despite their humble circumstances. "Who is that young woman?" Boaz asked his foreman, pointing toward Ruth. It was a simple question, but it would prove to be the beginning of one of history's greatest love stories. The moment when two lives intersected in ways that neither could have imagined. The foreman, who had been observing Ruth's work, was ready with information. "She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi," he reported. "She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters.' She has been working steadily from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter." This response told Boaz several important things. Ruth was connected to Naomi, whom he would have known as Elimelech's wife. She was a foreigner who had chosen to come to Israel. She was respectful in her approach to gleaning, asking permission rather than assuming rights. And she was a diligent worker who took her responsibilities seriously. Boaz was intrigued. A Moabite woman who had left her homeland to care for her Hebrew mother-in-law was unusual. Her commitment to hard work was admirable. Her respectful attitude was refreshing. And her connection to Elimelech's family made her more than just another stranger seeking charity. Without hesitation, Boaz approached Ruth directly. His manner was kind but respectful, acknowledging her dignity despite her circumstances, treating her as a person worthy of attention rather than merely an object of charity or curiosity. "My daughter," he said gently, using a term of respect and affection appropriate for a man of his age and status addressing a younger woman. "Listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me." This was an extraordinary offer. Boaz was providing Ruth with security, protection, and preferential treatment beyond what any gleaner could normally expect. He was essentially offering her a permanent place in his operation, guaranteeing her access to grain throughout the harvest season. But he went even further. "Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you, and whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." These additional provisions addressed Ruth's most pressing concerns: protection from harassment, permission to follow the main harvest for better gleaning opportunities, and access to fresh water, which was often restricted to regular employees. Boaz was treating Ruth like family rather than like a stranger. Ruth was overwhelmed by this unexpected kindness. She fell prostrate before Boaz, her face to the ground, and asked, "Why have I found such favour in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Her response revealed both gratitude and genuine puzzlement at receiving such generous treatment. The question also revealed Ruth's awareness of her precarious social position. As a Moabite woman, she had no claim on Hebrew kindness, no right to expect special treatment, no cultural protection beyond basic gleaning rights. Boaz's generosity was pure grace, unearned and unexpected. Boaz's answer revealed that he had already learned about Ruth's character and choices. "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before." This response showed that news of Ruth's loyalty had already spread through Bethlehem. Her choice to accompany Naomi had been noticed, discussed, and admired by people who understood the sacrifice involved. Ruth's reputation had preceded her into Boaz's field. "May the Lord repay you for what you have done," Boaz continued. "May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." He was pronouncing a blessing. but also acknowledging that Ruth had made a spiritual choice, embracing the God of Israel as her protector and provider. The phrase, "under whose wings you have come to take refuge," was particularly significant. Boaz was recognizing that Ruth's journey to Bethlehem wasn't just about geography, it was about faith. She had chosen to trust in Israel's God, to find security in divine rather than human protection. Ruth's heart was touched by these words. She had been seeking practical help, but had found someone who understood and appreciated the spiritual dimensions of her choice. Boaz wasn't just offering economic assistance, he was affirming her decision to embrace Hebrew faith and culture. "May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my lord," Ruth replied. "You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants." Her response was gracious, humble, and realistic about her social position, but it was also hopeful. Ruth was expressing her desire for continued relationship with this kind man, not just for economic reasons, but because she recognized in him someone who valued character over circumstances, who could see past her foreign origins to appreciate her heart. Boaz had made Ruth's day, but he had also set in motion events that would transform both their lives. The chance encounter in the field was becoming the foundation for something much deeper, a relationship that would prove beneficial not just to Ruth and Naomi, but to generations yet unborn. As Ruth returned to her gleaning with renewed energy and hope, she couldn't have imagined that the man who had shown her such kindness would soon become much more than a generous employer. Sometimes God's greatest gifts come disguised as ordinary kindness from unexpected sources. The field that had seemed like just another place to gather grain was becoming the location where Ruth's new life would truly begin, where her faithfulness would be rewarded, and where love would bloom in the most unlikely circumstances. After his conversation with Ruth, Boaz didn't simply return to his other duties and forget about the young Moabite woman gleaning in his field. Instead, he took immediate action to ensure that his words of kindness would be backed up by concrete protection and provision. Boaz called his foreman aside, giving specific instructions about Ruth's treatment. "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." These were extraordinary instructions. Normally, gleaners were restricted to gathering only what fell naturally or what was left in corners and forgotten spots. But Boaz was ordering his workers to deliberately create opportunities for Ruth to ensure she found abundant grain, to make her gleaning both productive and dignified. The foreman, accustomed to his master's generosity but still surprised by these specific orders, nodded his understanding and began implementing Boaz's instructions immediately. Word spread quickly among the workers that the Moabite woman was under their master's special protection. Ruth, unaware of these behind-the-scenes arrangements, continued her careful gleaning, working diligently but noticing that she seemed to be finding unusually good spots. That grain appeared to be more plentiful where she worked, that her efforts were yielding better results than she had experienced elsewhere. The workers, following Boaz's orders, began subtly helping Ruth without making it obvious. They dropped stalks near where she was working, pointed her toward productive areas, and made sure she had access to the best gleaning opportunities. Their assistance was discreet but effective. Some of the regular workers were initially puzzled by the special attention being given to a foreign gleaner, but Boaz's reputation for fairness and kindness meant that his instructions were followed without complaint. If their master wanted this woman protected and provided for, there must be good reasons. As the morning progressed, Ruth found herself gathering grain at a rate that seemed almost miraculous. Her bundle was growing larger than anything she had achieved on her first day. Her back was less tired because she didn't have to search as desperately for dropped stalks. Her spirits were lifted by the abundance. When the lunch hour arrived, Boaz sought out Ruth again. This time his offer was even more generous and personal. "Come over here," he said. "Have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." He was inviting her to share the meal provided for his workers, treating her like an employee rather than a charity case. Ruth was stunned by this invitation. Eating with the workers would place her in a completely different social category, acknowledging her not just as a gleaner, but as someone worthy of inclusion in the community of labourers. It was an honour she had never expected and wasn't sure she deserved. She sat with the harvesters, still somewhat shy and uncertain, but grateful for the inclusion. Boaz himself made sure she had plenty to eat, serving her roasted grain until she was satisfied and had some left over. His personal attention to her needs was both touching and slightly overwhelming. The other workers accepted Ruth's presence at their meal without question. If Boaz had invited her, she belonged there. They made room for her, included her in their conversations, and treated her with the respect due to anyone under their master's protection. During the meal, Ruth learned more about Boaz through observation. She saw how his workers responded to him with genuine affection rather than mere obedience, how he knew many of them by name, how he inquired about their families and concerns, how he created an atmosphere of mutual respect and care. She also noticed how the workers spoke about their master when he was briefly absent. Their comments revealed a man of integrity, generosity, and genuine concern for others' welfare, someone who lived his faith rather than merely professing it, who treated people according to their character rather than their social status. After the meal, Ruth returned to her gleaning with renewed energy and a heart full of gratitude. But she also carried with her a growing awareness that Boaz's kindness was exceptional, that such treatment wasn't normal for foreign women in her circumstances, that something special was happening. The afternoon brought continued evidence of Boaz's protection. When other gleaners tried to crowd into the best spots, the workers subtly guided them elsewhere. When the heat became oppressive, someone made sure Ruth had access to shade. When her water ran low, fresh supplies appeared without her having to ask. Ruth worked until evening, her bundle of grain growing larger than she had dared hope. But more importantly, her sense of security and belonging was growing as well. For the first time since arriving in Bethlehem, she felt less like a desperate foreigner and more like someone with a place in the community. As the workday ended, Boaz appeared again, making sure Ruth had been treated well, checking on her success, and subtly ensuring that she understood she was welcome to return the next day. His continued attention made it clear that his morning kindness hadn't been a momentary impulse. "Where did you glean today?" he asked. though he obviously knew the answer. Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. It was both a question and a blessing, acknowledging that Ruth's success hadn't been mere chance, that someone had been watching over her. Ruth gathered her grain and prepared for the journey home, her heart full of wonder at the day's experiences. She had expected to work hard for modest results, but had found abundance, protection, inclusion, and kindness beyond anything she could have imagined. The walk back to Naomi carried a different feeling than the previous evening. Instead of exhaustion and uncertainty, Ruth felt hopeful, energized, and curious about what God might be doing in her life. The field she had chosen randomly was proving to be a place of unexpected blessing, but perhaps most significantly, Ruth was beginning to understand something about the character of Hebrew society at its best. The laws about caring for strangers and the poor weren't just rules. They were expressions of a worldview that valued every person, that recognized divine image in human dignity, that practiced love as well as preached it. Boaz had shown Ruth what Hebrew faith looked like in practice, not just in synagogue services or religious festivals, but in daily business dealings, in treatment of employees, in response to need, in generosity toward outsiders. She was seeing the God of Israel through the actions of his faithful servant. As she approached their lodging, Ruth was eager to share the day's experiences with Naomi, to report not just the practical success of her gleaning, but the unexpected kindness she had encountered, to explore what this might mean for their future, and to seek wisdom about how to respond appropriately. The grain she carried was important for their immediate survival, but the relationships she was building might prove even more significant for their long-term security and happiness. Ruth was learning that sometimes God's provision comes not just through what we find, but through who finds us. Her second day in Boaz's field had transformed her understanding of what life in Bethlehem might hold. Instead of mere survival, she was beginning to glimpse possibilities for belonging, for purpose, for a future brighter than anything she had dared imagine when she first pledged to follow Naomi wherever she might go. When Ruth returned home with her abundant bundle of grain, Naomi's first reaction was amazement. "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." The quantity of grain was far beyond what any ordinary gleaning should have produced, suggesting that someone had shown extraordinary kindness. Ruth told her mother-in-law about her day, describing Boaz's kindness, his protection, his generosity, and his obvious respect for her choice to come to Israel. As she spoke, she watched Naomi's expression change from curiosity to recognition to something that looked like hope mixed with calculation. "The man's name is Boaz," Ruth concluded, expecting this information to mean little to Naomi, but her mother-in-law's reaction was immediate and intense, revealing that this name carried significant importance in their family history and current circumstances. "The Lord bless him," Naomi exclaimed, her voice carrying more enthusiasm than Ruth had heard since their arrival in Bethlehem. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." This response puzzled Ruth, who didn't understand the full implications of Boaz's family connections. Naomi continued with growing excitement. "That man is our close relative. He is one of our kinsman redeemers. These words opened up possibilities that Ruth hadn't even known existed, legal relationships and cultural obligations that could transform their desperate situation into something approaching security. Ruth listened with fascination as Naomi explained the concept of the kinsman redeemer in Hebrew law. Close relatives had both the right and responsibility to help family members in distress. This could include buying back sold property, paying off debts, or even marrying widowed relatives to preserve family lineage and provide protection. The explanation revealed why Boaz's kindness had been so extraordinary. He wasn't just being generous to a stranger. He was recognizing family obligations, treating Ruth with the care due to a relative by marriage, acknowledging connections that went back generations. But Naomi's mind was working beyond mere family duty. She was beginning to see possibilities for Ruth's future that went far beyond survival gleaning. If Boaz was indeed interested in Ruth, and if he could be encouraged to exercise his role as kinsman redeemer, then Ruth's story might have a much happier ending than anyone had dared imagine. He even said to me, "Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain," Ruth added. Not fully understanding the significance of this invitation, but noting how it made Naomi's eyes brighten even more. Naomi saw in this statement evidence that Boaz was thinking beyond temporary charity. He was offering Ruth ongoing protection and provision, treating her less like a needy stranger and more like someone with a permanent place in his operation, perhaps in his life. Over the following weeks, as Ruth continued gleaning in Boaz's fields, Naomi watched the relationship develop with growing interest. She observed how Ruth's reports became more detailed, how her daughter-in-law mentioned Boaz's words and actions with increasing frequency, how both seemed to be finding excuses for longer conversations. Naomi also noticed changes in Ruth herself. The young woman was taking more care with her appearance, speaking with greater confidence about life in Bethlehem, and showing signs of healing from the grief that had marked her since Mahlon's death. Something was clearly growing between Ruth and Boaz, but Naomi was too experienced to leave such an important matter to chance. Hebrew courtship customs were complex, involving family negotiations, property considerations, and careful attention to social proprieties. If anything was going to develop between Ruth and Boaz, it would need careful guidance. As the harvest season neared its end, Naomi began formulating a plan. She understood that Boaz was attracted to Ruth but might hesitate to pursue a relationship without clear encouragement. He was older, well established, perhaps concerned about the appropriateness of courting a young foreign widow under his protection. Ruth, meanwhile, was obviously drawn to Boaz but had no understanding of Hebrew courtship customs, no knowledge of how to navigate the complex social and legal requirements, no guidance about appropriate ways to express interest or encourage pursuit. Left to themselves, they might remain forever in polite but distant admiration. The plan Naomi developed was bold, culturally appropriate but personally risky. It would require Ruth to take initiative in a way that could either open the door to marriage or result in embarrassing rejection. But Naomi had observed both parties carefully and believed the risk was worth taking. "My daughter, I must find a home for you, where you will be well provided for," Naomi began, framing her proposal in terms of Ruth's security and happiness. Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor. But don't let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. This was the plan. Ruth would approach Boaz at the threshing floor, a location and timing that would provide privacy for conversation but also witnesses nearby for propriety. She would present herself in a way that honoured both Hebrew customs and her own dignity, creating an opportunity for Boaz to express his intentions if he chose to do so. Naomi continued with specific instructions. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying, then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do. These directions were based on ancient customs of approaching a potential kinsman redeemer, symbolic actions that would communicate Ruth's request for protection and provision. Ruth listened to these instructions with a mixture of nervousness and trust. The plan seemed bold to the point of shocking, but Naomi's confidence was reassuring. And Ruth had learned to trust her mother-in-law's understanding of Hebrew culture, even when it challenged her own comfort level. "I will do whatever you say," Ruth replied, demonstrating the same loyal commitment that had brought her to Bethlehem in the first place. She was willing to risk embarrassment, rejection, even scandal, if it meant securing a future that would benefit both herself and Naomi. As they prepared for this crucial encounter, both women understood that they were taking a significant gamble. If Boaz responded positively, Ruth's future could be transformed from poverty and uncertainty to prosperity and security. If he rejected her approach, they might lose his protection entirely, facing an even more desperate situation than before. But Naomi's years of life experience, her understanding of Boaz's character, and her observation of his growing interest in Ruth had convinced her that this was the right time and the right approach. Sometimes love needs a gentle push to overcome social barriers and personal hesitations. The plan also reflected Naomi's transformation from the bitter woman who had wanted to be called Mara. Through watching Ruth's faithfulness and experiencing God's provision through Boaz's kindness, she was beginning to hope again, to believe that their story might have a happy ending after all. As evening approached and Ruth prepared for her mission to the threshing floor, both women were nervous but determined. They had come too far, survived too much, and seen too many signs of God's favour to let fear prevent them from pursuing the happiness that seemed within reach. The night ahead would test not only Ruth's courage, but also Boaz's character. It would reveal whether his kindness was merely charitable or truly romantic, whether his interest in Ruth could overcome social conventions and family obligations, and whether their growing affection could blossom into marriage and lifelong partnership. Ruth spent the early evening in careful preparation, washing away the dust and sweat of her gleaning work, anointing herself with the precious oil they had saved for special occasions, and putting on her best garment, the one remaining dress that spoke of better times and dignified circumstances. As she prepared, Ruth's mind raced with questions and concerns. What if Boaz rejected her approach? What if he misunderstood her intentions? What if someone else saw her and drew wrong conclusions? The plan that had seemed reasonable in daylight felt increasingly risky as darkness approached. But Ruth had committed herself to Naomi's wisdom and to the possibility of a future with Boaz. Her loyalty had brought her this far, from Moab to Bethlehem, from despair to hope, from poverty to the edge of prosperity. She would not falter now when so much hung in the balance. The threshing floor was located on a hill outside Bethlehem, where evening breezes could help separate grain from chaff. It was a place of celebration as well as work, where the completion of harvest brought feasting, wine, and the joy of another year's successful labour. Ruth made her way carefully through the darkness, guided by the sounds of laughter and conversation, the glow of fires, and the rhythmic noise of winnowing. She stayed in the shadows, observing, waiting for the right moment to approach according to Naomi's instructions. Boaz was clearly visible among his workers, supervising the final stages of winnowing, ensuring that the grain was properly cleaned and stored, and participating in the traditional celebration that marked the end of barley harvest. He seemed relaxed, happy, surrounded by people who obviously respected and enjoyed working for him. Ruth watched as the evening progressed, noting Boaz's interactions with his workers, his careful attention to the work, his generous sharing of food and wine, and his obvious satisfaction with another successful harvest. She was seeing him in his element, confident, prosperous, completely at home in his community. As the night grew later, the celebration gradually wound down. Workers began settling down to sleep on the threshing floor, a common practice that provided security for the valuable grain and allowed for early morning resumption of work. Gradually, the noise and activity diminished to quiet murmurs and gentle snoring. Ruth waited until she was certain that Boaz had eaten and drunk his fill, had finished his supervisory duties, and had settled down for the night at the edge of a pile of grain. She could see his sleeping form in the moonlight, peaceful, unguarded, unaware of her presence, with her heart pounding. Ruth approached silently. She moved carefully to avoid waking him or alerting others to her presence, reached the place where he lay, and quietly uncovered his feet according to Naomi's instructions. Then she lay down at his feet and waited. The symbolism of her action was clear to anyone familiar with Hebrew customs. By uncovering his feet and lying there, she was placing herself under his protection, requesting that he exercise his role as kinsman redeemer, asking for his care and provision in the most humble and appropriate way possible. In the middle of the night, Boaz stirred, perhaps sensing a presence, or feeling the cool air on his uncovered feet. He turned and was startled to discover someone lying there. "Who are you?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying surprise but not alarm. "I am your servant, Ruth," she replied, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a kinsman redeemer of our family." She was making her request clearly, invoking both his family obligations and her need for protection, asking him to consider marriage. Boaz's response revealed both his understanding of her request and his deep appreciation for her character. "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he said warmly. "This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor." His words showed that he had been aware of Ruth's options, that younger men in Bethlehem had noticed this beautiful, hard-working foreign woman, but that she had chosen to approach him instead. An older man who could offer security and family connection rather than merely romantic attraction. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid, Boaz continued, his voice gentle and reassuring. I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character. He was acknowledging her request favourably, praising her reputation, and accepting the possibility of marriage. But then Boaz revealed a complication that Ruth hadn't anticipated. Although it is true that I am a kinsman redeemer of your family, there is another who is more closely related than I. Stay here for the night. And in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your kinsman redeemer, good, let him redeem you. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. This news was both encouraging and disappointing. Encouraging because Boaz was clearly willing to marry her if legally possible. Disappointing because another man had prior claim according to Hebrew law. Someone who would have to be approached first, whose decision would determine whether Ruth's proposal could be accepted. Ruth spent the rest of the night lying at Boaz's feet, not sleeping but processing this new information. She had taken the initiative, made her proposal, and received a favourable response. But now she had to wait while Hebrew legal procedures determined her fate. Boaz, meanwhile, was probably doing his own thinking, calculating how to approach the nearer kinsman, considering legal and practical strategies, and planning how to navigate the complex negotiations that would be required to secure Ruth's hand in marriage. As dawn approached, Boaz quietly woke Ruth. Don't let it be known that a woman came to the threshing floor, he whispered. He was protecting her reputation, ensuring that their midnight encounter couldn't be misinterpreted or used to damage her standing in the community. Before Ruth left, Boaz filled her shawl with 6 measures of barley. Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed, he said. This gift served multiple purposes, providing food for Ruth and Naomi, demonstrating his continued generosity, and sending a message that their conversation had gone well. Ruth made her way home through the early morning darkness, her heart full of mixed emotions, hope for a future with Boaz, anxiety about the nearer kinsman's decision, gratitude for Boaz's kindness and respect, and wonder at how dramatically her life was potentially changing. The weight of the grain in her shawl was substantial, but the weight of possibility in her heart was even greater. She had taken the greatest risk of her life, approached the man she had come to love, and discovered that her feelings were reciprocated. Now she had to wait while others determined whether that love could become marriage. As she approached their lodging, Ruth prepared to share the night's events with Naomi, to report both the encouragement and the complication, to seek wisdom about what to expect next, and to wait together for news about whether her boldness would be rewarded with happiness. The threshing floor encounter had been successful beyond her hopes, but also more complex than she had anticipated. Ruth was learning that love in the ancient world required not just courage and compatibility, but also legal navigation, family negotiations, and patience while proper procedures were followed. Her midnight mission had opened a door, but whether she would be able to walk through it depended on decisions and negotiations that were now beyond her control. All she could do was wait, hope, and trust that the God who had brought her this far would complete the work he had begun. When Ruth returned from the threshing floor, Naomi was waiting anxiously for news. "How did it go? My daughter?" she asked immediately, reading in Ruth's face both hope and uncertainty, success mixed with complication. The grain Ruth carried suggested that Boaz had responded favourably, but her expression indicated that the situation was more complex than they had anticipated. Ruth recounted the night's events, describing Boaz's kind reception of her proposal, his obvious willingness to marry her, and his praise for her character. But then she shared the disappointing news about the nearer kinsman, the legal complication that could prevent their marriage despite their mutual affection. Naomi listened with mixed emotions: relief that Boaz was indeed interested in Ruth, concern about this unexpected obstacle, and admiration for Boaz's integrity in acknowledging another man's prior rights. She had known Boaz was honourable, but his handling of this delicate situation confirmed the depth of his character. "Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens," Naomi advised, understanding that they were now in a period of uncertainty that could only be resolved by legal proceedings and negotiations between men. "For the man will not rest until the matter is settled today." Boaz spent the morning formulating his approach. He needed to present the situation honestly, giving the nearer kinsman full information about both the opportunities and obligations involved. He couldn't manipulate the outcome, but he could ensure that the decision was made with complete understanding of the implications. Ruth and Naomi, meanwhile, tried to occupy themselves with normal activities, but their thoughts kept returning to the negotiations that were probably taking place. Every hour that passed without news increased their anxiety. Every sound from the street made them wonder if Boaz was returning with a decision. The waiting also gave Ruth time to reflect on how dramatically her life had changed. 6 months ago, she had been a married woman in Moab with a secure, if modest, life. Now she was a widowed foreigner whose future depended on the legal decisions of men she barely knew. The contrast was both humbling and frightening. But Ruth also recognized God's hand in her circumstances. Her choice to follow Naomi had led to gleaning in Boaz's field. Her faithfulness had earned his respect and affection. Her courage at the threshing floor had opened the possibility of marriage. Even this current complication might be part of a larger plan she couldn't yet understand. Naomi used the waiting time to educate Ruth further about Hebrew marriage customs, explaining how kinsman-redeemer relationships worked, what the legal procedures would involve, why everything had to be done publicly and formally. She wanted Ruth to understand the process, even if she couldn't control it. The explanation helped Ruth appreciate Boaz's integrity. He could have simply accepted her proposal without mentioning the nearer kinsman, could have kept silent about another man's rights, could have claimed her for himself without regard for legal precedents. His honesty, even when it complicated his own desires, demonstrated genuine character. As the day progressed, both women found themselves praying, asking the God of Israel to work in their circumstances, to influence the nearer kinsman's decision, to open the way for Ruth and Boaz to marry if that was indeed his will. They had seen enough of God's provision to trust him with this uncertainty. The suspense was heightened by their knowledge that this decision would affect not just Ruth's personal happiness, but their economic survival. If she married Boaz, both women would have security, purpose, and family connection. If the nearer kinsman claimed her, their future would depend entirely on his character and intentions, which were unknown. Ruth also worried about Boaz's feelings. He had shown genuine affection for her, had responded warmly to her proposal, had expressed willingness to marry her. How would he handle the disappointment if another man claimed the right that he clearly wanted to exercise himself? But even in her anxiety, Ruth was learning something important about love and integrity. Boaz's willingness to honor another man's legal rights, even at personal cost, made him more attractive, not less. His character was proving itself under pressure, demonstrating that he would be not just a loving husband but an honorable one. The waiting continued through the afternoon, each hour bringing them closer to some kind of resolution, but also intensifying their nervousness about what that resolution might be. They had committed themselves to trusting God's sovereignty, but human emotions don't always align easily with theological principles. As evening approached, Ruth and Naomi found themselves watching the street, listening for footsteps, hoping for news. They had done everything they could do, made every effort within their power, taken every risk they deemed appropriate. Now they could only wait for others to determine their destiny. The question that haunted them both was simple but crucial. Would the nearer kinsman want to redeem Elimelech's land enough to accept marriage to Ruth as part of the package? His answer would determine whether Ruth's love story would have a happy ending, or whether she would find herself married to a stranger who might view her as an unwelcome obligation rather than a desired bride. Tonight would bring either celebration or resignation, either the joy of answered prayer or the disappointment of dashed hopes. Either way, Ruth was learning that following God sometimes means accepting uncertainty, trusting His goodness even when His plans aren't immediately clear, and finding peace in His sovereignty even when circumstances seem beyond human control. The nearer kinsman held Ruth's future in his hands, but both women were choosing to believe that ultimately her future rested in the hands of the God who had brought her from Moab to Bethlehem, from despair to hope, from gleaning in fields to the possibility of owning them. Early in the morning, Boaz made his way to the city gate, the traditional place where legal business was conducted in Hebrew towns, where elders gathered to witness transactions, and where important community decisions were made. This would be the venue for resolving Ruth's future, the place where love would meet law, where personal desires would be tested against legal obligations. The city gate was already busy with morning activity, merchants preparing for the day's business, farmers bringing produce to market, and citizens gathering to discuss community affairs. Boaz took his place among the respected men, watching for the arrival of the kinsman who held Ruth's fate in his hands. Soon the man appeared, going about his normal business, unaware that his day was about to be interrupted by a proposition that would require an immediate and life-changing decision. Boaz called to him using the formal address required by law. "Come over here, my friend, and sit down." The invitation was polite, but carried the weight of legal summons. The kinsman responded, perhaps curious about what business Boaz might have with him, perhaps sensing from Boaz's serious manner that this was more than casual conversation. He took his seat, joining what would become an official legal proceeding with witnesses and formal procedures. Boaz then called for 10 elders to serve as witnesses, the number required by Hebrew law for important transactions. These men represented the community's authority, their presence ensuring that any agreement reached would be legally binding and publicly acknowledged. The stage was set for a formal negotiation. Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech, Boaz began, presenting the first part of his proposal. This was news to the kinsman, who hadn't known that land redemption was available. The opportunity seemed straightforward, a chance to acquire good property from a relative in need. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention, Boaz continued, following proper legal protocol, and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me, so I will know, for no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line. This presentation was scrupulously fair. Boaz was giving the nearer kinsman full opportunity to claim his rights, making no attempt to hide the availability of the land or to discourage his participation. Despite his personal interest in the outcome, Boaz was ensuring that legal procedures were followed properly and completely. The kinsman's immediate response was positive. "I will redeem it," he said, apparently seeing the land purchase as a good business opportunity, a chance to expand his holdings and increase his wealth. The property was desirable, the price presumably reasonable, and the legal right to purchase was clearly his. But then Boaz revealed the additional obligation that came with the land. On the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. The land purchase wasn't separate from marriage responsibility. They were legally linked, requiring acceptance of both or neither. This revelation completely changed the kinsman's calculation. Acquiring land was one thing, but marrying a foreign widow was quite another, especially when that marriage carried the obligation to raise children who would inherit the very property he was purchasing, rather than his own existing heirs. The implications were significant. If the kinsman married Ruth and she bore sons, those children would be considered Elimelech's heirs, not his own. The land he purchased would ultimately belong to them, not to his current family line. He would be investing his resources to benefit another man's legacy, not his own. After a moment of consideration, the kinsman withdrew his offer. "Then I cannot redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it." He was choosing his existing family obligations over the opportunity to expand his holdings, prioritizing his current heirs over potential complications. This decision was both disappointing and relieving for the kinsman. Disappointing because he lost the opportunity to acquire good land. Relieving because he avoided the complex obligations that would have come with marrying Ruth. He was choosing the simpler path, the one that didn't require major life changes or cultural adaptations. But for Boaz, the kinsman's withdrawal was exactly what he had hoped for. The way was now clear for him to exercise his own rights as the next kinsman redeemer, to marry the woman he loved, and to acquire land that would support their future family. Love and law were finally aligned. to formalize the kinsman's withdrawal. He removed his sandal and gave it to Boaz, an ancient custom that symbolized the transfer of rights and responsibilities. The sandal served as a physical token of the legal transaction, evidence that the decision had been made publicly and irrevocably. Boaz accepted the sandal, then made his own public declaration. "Today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Kilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown." This declaration accomplished several important things. It established Boaz's legal right to marry Ruth. It demonstrated his willingness to accept all the obligations involved. It provided public notice of his intentions. And it honored the memory of Ruth's deceased husband by ensuring his family line would continue. The witnesses responded with formal approval. "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem." This blessing revealed the community's acceptance of Ruth, comparing her to the matriarchs of Israel, expressing hope for her fertility and happiness, and acknowledging her transition from foreign widow to honored wife. The people of Bethlehem were welcoming her not just as Boaz's bride, but as a full member of their community. The legal proceedings were complete. Ruth's future was secured. Boaz had won the right to marry the woman he loved, and the community had witnessed and blessed their union. What had begun with uncertainty and anxiety was ending with joy and celebration. As news of the transaction spread through Bethlehem, Ruth and Naomi would soon learn that their waiting was over, their fears were resolved, and their prayers were answered. The God who had brought Ruth from Moab to Israel, from despair to hope, from gleaning to marriage, had completed another chapter in his story of redemption. Boaz left the city gate with legal authority to marry Ruth, but more importantly, with community blessing, divine approval, and the joy of knowing that love had triumphed over every obstacle. The sandal in his hand was evidence of a completed transaction, but the happiness in his heart was evidence of God's faithful provision. The news travelled through Bethlehem faster than Boaz could walk home from the city gate. Ruth the Moabite is going to marry Boaz. The announcement brought smiles to many faces, surprise to others, and satisfaction to those who had watched the relationship develop with interest and approval. When the news reached Ruth and Naomi, their relief was overwhelming. The anxious waiting was over. The legal complications were resolved, and Ruth's future was secured beyond anything they had dared hope. The young woman who had arrived as a desperate foreign widow was about to become the wife of one of Bethlehem's most respected men. The wedding preparations were joyful, but brief. In Hebrew culture, marriages were celebrated with community feasts, blessings from elders, and rituals that welcomed the bride into her new family. For Ruth, this meant not just marrying Boaz, but being formally adopted into the Hebrew nation, completing the transformation that had begun with her choice to follow Naomi. Boaz approached the marriage with deep happiness. His attraction to Ruth had grown into genuine love. His respect for her character had deepened into admiration. His desire to protect her had matured into commitment to cherish her for life. The waiting, the legal complications, the uncertainty, had all made this moment more precious. Ruth, meanwhile, was discovering that her bold approach at the threshing floor had been the beginning of something beautiful. Boaz was proving to be not just a generous provider, but a tender husband, someone who valued her thoughts, appreciated her background, and welcomed her completely into his life and family. The marriage ceremony itself was a celebration of more than just two people finding love. It was a testament to God's faithfulness, a demonstration of how loyalty and kindness are rewarded, and a symbol of how outsiders can find belonging in the community of faith. Ruth's story had become Bethlehem's story, a reminder that God's family includes people from every nation. But the greatest joy came when Ruth conceived. The news brought celebration throughout Bethlehem, where Ruth had been accepted not just as Boaz's wife, but as a valued member of the community. Her pregnancy was seen as God's blessing on their marriage, confirmation that her integration into Hebrew society was complete and approved. When Ruth gave birth to a son, the celebration was extraordinary. This child represented more than just a new baby. He was the continuation of Elimelech's family line, the fulfillment of kinsman-redeemer obligations, and the living proof that God rewards faithfulness across cultural boundaries. The women of Bethlehem came to Naomi with words of blessing. "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." These words revealed how completely Ruth had been accepted. The community was acknowledging that her love for Naomi exceeded even what might be expected from biological children, that her faithfulness had been extraordinary, and that her presence had transformed Naomi's life from bitterness to blessing. Naomi took the baby, held him close, and experienced a transformation that completed her journey from despair to joy. The woman who had declared that God's hand was against her now held evidence of his favour. The bitter Mara was becoming pleasant Naomi again through the gift of this grandchild. They named the boy Obed, meaning servant or worshipper, a name that reflected their gratitude to God and their hope that he would grow up to serve faithfully. But none of them could have imagined that this baby would become the grandfather of King David, placing Ruth in the direct lineage of Israel's greatest king. Years later, when genealogies were compiled, Ruth's name would appear in the family tree of Israel's kings. The Moabite woman who had pledged, "Your people shall be my people," would be listed among the ancestors of David, and ultimately of Jesus. Her faithfulness had literally changed the course of history, but Ruth couldn't have known any of this as she lived her daily life in Bethlehem. She was simply being faithful in small things, loving Naomi, working hard, trusting God, following her heart, making choices based on loyalty rather than calculating their historical significance. Naomi, in her old age, often reflected on the journey that had brought such unexpected blessing. The famine that had seemed like curse had become the path to redemption. The losses that had felt like divine punishment had become the foundation for divine provision. The bitterness that had overwhelmed her had been transformed into sweetness beyond imagination. The love story of Ruth and Boaz became one of Bethlehem's favourite tales, told and retold as an example of how God rewards faithfulness, how love transcends cultural boundaries, and how loyalty brings blessing. Their marriage was proof that the best stories often begin with the most difficult circumstances. As Ruth grew older, she never forgot her Moabite heritage, but she also never regretted leaving it behind. She had found in Boaz not just a husband, but a partner in faith. In Bethlehem, not just a home, but a calling. In the God of Israel, not just a religion, but a relationship that gave meaning to every day. Her story continued to inspire, showing that foreigners could find acceptance, that widows could find new love, that poor gleaners could become wealthy wives, that loyalty could be rewarded beyond imagination, and that God's plans often unfold through ordinary people making extraordinary choices.